I play my Pot of Greed card. Huh, I bet you wish you'd drawn this card, don't you, Joseph? Now, I'm able to draw 2 new cards, which is something that you need to do quite desperately.
I'm throwing down the spell card, Pot of Greed! And now I'll use its magical charm, and then draw 2 additional cards from my deck.
For my move, I play the spell card, Pot of Greed.
I play my spell card, Pot of Greed. Next, I'll
And now, I'll use my Pot of Greed.
I play Pot of Greed! I play the spell Pot of Greed.
Now I play the magic card, Pot of Greed, allowing me to draw 2 more cards.
Observe my face-down card, Pot of Greed! Thanks to the effect of this magic card, I can now draw 2 more cards from my deck. Pot of Greed lets me draw 2 cards from my deck. Then I'll activate my Pot of Greed! This lets me draw 2 cards. I'll begin by activating my Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 more cards. Second, I activate Pot of Greed, which lets me draw 2 more cards from my deck. With this, the magic card Pot of Greed. This allows me to draw 2 more cards from my deck. Next, I play Pot of Greed. This allows me to take 2 cards from my deck and add them to my hand.
First, I activate Pot of Greed. So I'll be drawing 2 more cards. I play Pot of Greed. So I'll draw 2 cards, and I activate
The spell card, Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 cards.
I'm playing the magic of Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 more cards. I play the spell Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 more cards. My go. And I play Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 cards. And I activate the spell card, Pot of Greed. Now I'm allowed to draw 2 additional cards from my deck to my hand. I'm activating Pot of Greed. And with this spell, I can draw 2 more cards. I play the spell card, Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 cards. Ha! One of my faves, Pot of Greed. That's 2 cards for me and a whole lot of pain for you. I play Pot of Greed, which means I get to draw 2 more cards. I play Pot of Greed, so I can draw 2 cards. I activate Pot of Greed, so now I can draw 2 cards. I just drew Pot of Greed, so I pick up 2 more cards.
I'll start by playing Pot of Greed. So now I get to draw 2 more cards.
Next I play Pot of Greed, which lets me draw 2 more cards. Then I activate Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 cards from my deck. I play Pot of Greed, so I draw 2 cards. I activate Pot of Greed. It looks like it's 2 cards for me.
And I'll start with this, Pot of Greed. And you know what that means. I get 2 more cards.
I play the magic card, Pot of Greed. It allows me to draw 2 cards from my deck. I play this, Pot of Greed. It allows me to draw 2 new cards to refresh my hand. I activate the magic card, Pot of Greed. It allows me to draw 2 more cards. Now, I activate my Pot of Greed magic card, so I can draw 2 cards. First, I'll play my Pot of Greed magic card, letting me draw twice. First, I activate my Pot of Greed magic card. That lets me draw 2 more cards.
And I play Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 cards from my deck.
Well, what do you know, Aster? Pot of Greed. I'll draw 2. I activate Pot of Greed, so I pick up 2 more cards.
Watch the pro, Pot of Greed. I pick up 2 cards. I play Pot of Greed, which I'm sure you know lets me add a couple more cards to my hand.
Well, looky here.
I think my luck is beginning to change now.
All right!
Pot of Greed lets me draw 2 cards. Now I activate Pot of Greed, which lets me draw 2 cards. Next, I activate the magic card, Pot of Greed. Now I can draw 2 more cards. First, I'll play a magic card known as Pot of Greed. So I draw 2 cards.
I play Pot of Greed, so I draw 2 cards. Oh, Pot of Greed. Looks like I get 2 more. Go, Pot of Greed. So I play this. Anything look familiar? I have a Pot of Greed also, and it lets me draw 2 cards.
I play my Pot of Greed! And with 2 more cards to choose from.
And I'll start with Pot of Greed. So I draw 2 cards.
And I activate Pot of Greed. So now, I get to draw 2 new cards. I play Pot of Greed. This spell card allows me to draw 2 new cards from my deck.
Fine. I activate my Pot of Greed. So I'll draw 2 cards. Because I play Pot of Greed. So I get 2 more cards.
See, I'll play this, my Pot of Greed, a magic card that allows me to draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I'll begin my turn by activating the magic card Pot of Greed. That allows me to draw 2 more cards from my deck. I'll start by activating the magic card Pot of Greed, which lets me draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I play Pot of Greed. You know what that means, don't you? I can draw 2 additional cards from my deck. I activate the magic card Pot of Greed. That lets me draw 2 cards from my deck.
I'll play a magic card. My Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 cards.
The magic card Pot of Greed! Thanks to this card, I can now draw 2 new cards from my deck, Kaiba.
I activate my Pot of Greed magic card. Now I can draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I activate Pot of Greed. This lets me draw twice.
I'm gonna use my Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 more cards.
I activate my Pot of Greed, which, of course, allows me to draw 2 more cards.
Then I play Pot of Greed, so I can draw twice more.
I activate a personal favorite of mine called Pot of Greed. Sorry, now I pick up 2 more cards.
I activate Pot of Greed. Now I can draw 2 cards from my deck.
Now I activate my Pot of Greed, so I'll be drawing 2 more cards.
I play Pot of Greed, which lets me draw 2 cards.
I'll play my Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I activate the spell card Pot of Greed. This lets me draw 2 cards.
My favorite. It's my Pot of Greed. 2 more for me.
The spell card Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 cards from my deck.
I'll be playing Pot of Greed. Check it out. I get 2 cards.
Start by activating this, my Pot of Greed spell card. So 2 more cards for me.
I activate Pot of Greed, so I draw 2 cards.
First, I play Pot of Greed. It lets me draw 2 more cards from my deck.
I play the spell Pot of Greed. Now I may draw 2 more cards.
I've created an exclusive card just for you, Yugi boy.
No way!
I've hidden this one-of-a-kind card somewhere in this room. Think strategically now. Where can one find an extra card?
Pot of Greed! In the game of Duel Monsters, that lets you draw extra cards.
You